Most people who lose their job don't panic on day 1. They panic on day 93. That's when the severance runs out, when the optimism fades, when the credit card minimum payments start looking like actual problems. And that's when they realize the advice everyone gave them about emergency funds wasn't some abstract financial virtue signal, it was a timer, and theirs just hit 0. The 6-month emergency fund is the most repeated piece of financial advice in existence. Personal finance gurus say it, your parents probably said it, even the government whispers it through their consumer protection websites. But here's what almost nobody explains. Why 6 months? Why not 3? Why not 12? And more importantly, where are you actually supposed to keep this money so it doesn't just evaporate into nothing while you wait for disaster to maybe never come? Because that's the contradiction sitting at the heart of this whole thing. You're supposed to set aside enough money to survive half a year without income, lock it away somewhere safe, and then hope you never touch it. It's financial insurance you pay yourself. And like all insurance, it only makes sense when you look at what happens without it. Let's start with the number itself. 6 months sounds arbitrary. It sounds like someone just picked a time frame that felt responsible and everyone else nodded along. But it's not random. It's based on cold math that most people would rather not think about. The median time it takes someone to find a new job in the United States hovers between 3 and 5 months. That's median, which means half the people take longer. In a recession, that number stretches. In 2009, the average job search took over 9 months. If you're over 50, if you're in a niche industry, if you're looking for something that pays what you used to make instead of just anything that'll cover rent, you add months to that clock. 6 months gives you buffer. It gives you the ability to be selective instead of desperate. It gives you time to actually look for the right opportunity instead of taking the first offer out of pure survival panic. That's the theory anyway. But here's the thing most people discover too late. Losing your income doesn't just mean your paycheck stops. It means your expenses explode. You lose employer health insurance, so now you're paying COBRA premiums that can run $1,500 a month for a family. You're driving more because you're going to interviews. You're buying new clothes because the ones you had don't fit the role you're applying for. You're spending more on food because cooking from scratch requires energy you don't have when you're sending out 40 applications a week. The stress spending creeps in. The small leaks you ignored when money was flowing become floods. So 6 months of expenses isn't really 6 months. It's more like 4 if you're disciplined, 3 if you're human. And that's assuming you're dealing with job loss. The emergency fund isn't just for unemployment. It's for the transmission that explodes, the medical bill that insurance decides not to cover, the funeral across the country you have to attend, the pipe that bursts in January and floods your basement. Life doesn't send you one disaster at a time with polite spacing in between. It sends them in clusters. The 6-month fund exists because financial shocks don't operate on your timeline. They operate on theirs.
So let's say you accept the premise. You agree that 6 months of expenses sitting in a safety net is smart. The next question is the one that actually determines whether this works or falls apart. Where do you put it? Because this is where the advice gets weird. Everyone tells you the emergency fund needs to be liquid, accessible, safe. You can't have it locked up in a retirement account. You can't have it in stocks that might be down 30% the exact week you need the money. You need to be able to touch it immediately, without penalty, without risk. That means cash, or something close to it. But cash has a problem. It dies. Not literally, but inflation kills it slowly. If you stuffed 6 months of expenses under your mattress in 2020, that same pile of bills buys you significantly less in 2025. Every year you don't need your emergency fund is a year it loses value. 3% inflation means your safety net shrinks 3% annually just by sitting there. Compounded over a decade, you're looking at real erosion. So the traditional answer has been put it in a savings account. For a long time, that was a joke. Savings accounts were paying 0.01% interest. You'd earn 11 cents a year on $10,000. Banks were essentially charging you to hold your own money through inflation while they lent it out at 5% and pocketed the difference. But something shifted in 2022. The Federal Reserve started hiking interest rates to fight inflation, and suddenly high-yield savings accounts became actual options. 4%, 5%, sometimes higher. Not enough to beat inflation entirely, but enough to slow the bleeding. Enough that your emergency fund wasn't actively decaying while it waited. These accounts are FDIC insured up to $250,000. They're liquid, you can move money in and out within a day or two. They're boring, and boring is exactly what you want from an emergency fund. The temptation, of course, is to get clever. People look at that pile of money and think, I could put this in an index fund and get 8% average returns. And they're not wrong about the average, but averages don't matter when you need the money during a bad month. The market doesn't care that you lost your job. If you get laid off in the middle of a bear market, your emergency fund just became an emergency. You're forced to sell at a loss, locking in damage that might have recovered if you'd had time. Some people split the difference. They keep 3 months in cash and 3 months in something slightly riskier. That's not insane, but it requires discipline and honest assessment of your risk tolerance, and most people overestimate both. The most dangerous place to keep an emergency fund is also the most common: nowhere. 63% of Americans can't cover a $500 emergency without going into debt, not because they don't earn enough, though many don't, but because the money never gets set aside. It gets absorbed. It goes toward the better apartment, the nicer car, the vacation that felt justified at the time. And then the emergency happens, and the credit card becomes the emergency fund. Except credit card debt costs you 20% interest, so now you're not just broke, you're paying a penalty for being broke, and the hole gets deeper. Building an emergency fund is painfully slow. If you're saving $500 a month, it takes you 12 months to build a $6,000 cushion. If your monthly expenses are $4,000, 6 months of coverage is $24,000. At $500 a month, that's 4 years. 4 years of redirecting money away from things you want, things that feel more urgent, things that actually improve your life right now. And the entire time, there's a voice in your head saying, nothing bad has happened yet, maybe nothing will. That voice is a liar, but it's persuasive. The psychology of emergency fund building is brutal because the reward is invisible. You don't get anything for having it, you only avoid loss. And human brains are terrible at valuing avoided loss. We're wired to prioritize immediate gain over distant protection. That's why people buy lottery tickets and skip insurance. The only way the emergency fund math works emotionally is if you've already experienced the free fall. If you've already lived through the month where rent was due and you had no idea where it was coming from. If you've already felt the stomach drop of opening a medical bill you can't pay. Once you've been there, the emergency fund stops being abstract. It becomes oxygen. But if you haven't been there, it's just money you're not spending on life. Let's talk about what 6 months of expenses actually means, because this is where people make quiet mistakes. Your expenses are not your income. If you make $6,000 a month and spend $5,000, your emergency fund needs to cover $30,000, not $36,000. But here's the trap. Most people don't actually know what they spend. They know the big numbers: rent, car payment, student loans, but they forget the subscriptions, the groceries, the gas, the insurance premiums, the phone bill, the internet, the haircuts, the coffees that only cost $4 but happen 70 times a quarter. When you actually add it up, the number is higher than you thought. And then there's the question of whether you cut expenses during an emergency. Can you cancel the gym membership? Can you stop contributing to your 401k temporarily? Can you switch to the cheaper phone plan? Theoretically, yes. In practice, people don't. Or they cut the wrong things and keep the expensive habits that feel non-negotiable. The smart move is to calculate 2 numbers: your current monthly burn rate and your absolute minimum survival number. The minimum is rent, utilities, food, transportation, insurance, and debt payments. Nothing else. That's the floor. The real number is probably somewhere between the floor and your current lifestyle. 6 months of the minimum might be achievable. 6 months of your current lifestyle might not be. And this is where the advice starts to crack, because personal finance influencers will tell you to build the 6-month fund before you do anything else, before you invest, before you pay off debt beyond the minimums, before you save for a house. The emergency fund comes first.
But if you're carrying credit card debt at 19% interest, that math doesn't work. You're losing nearly 20 cents on every dollar while your emergency fund earns 4. The spread is massive. You're paying for security with borrowed money, which is insane. The compromise most experts land on is this: build a small emergency fund first, 1 month, maybe 2, enough to handle a surprise car repair without spiraling. Then attack high-interest debt. Then come back and finish the full 6 months. Then start investing. But life doesn't wait for your financial optimization flowchart. The emergency often arrives while you're still in step 2.
There's a darker angle to the 6-month emergency fund that nobody wants to talk about. It only works if you have discretionary income. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, the idea of setting aside 6 months of expenses isn't advice, it's fiction. You can't save what you don't have. And telling someone who's already drowning that they need a bigger boat doesn't help them stay afloat. 40% of American households couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency without selling something or borrowing. For them, the 6-month emergency fund is a luxury item. It's aspirational at best, which means the people who need it most are the least able to build it. This creates a bifurcation. People with cushion build more cushion. People without cushion take on debt when emergencies hit, which makes future emergencies harder to absorb, which creates more debt. The gap widens. The emergency fund, in that sense, isn't just financial advice. It's a sorting mechanism. It separates those who can withstand shocks from those who can't. And once you're on the wrong side of that line, climbing back over gets exponentially harder. So where does that leave us? The 6-month emergency fund is not a myth. It's not outdated advice from a different economy. It's math. Cold, uncomfortable, unavoidable math. If you lose your income, you need time to replace it without destroying everything you've built. 6 months gives you that time. Maybe barely, maybe not quite, but it's the buffer between setback and collapse. The question isn't whether you need it. The question is whether it'll be there when you do. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Even if you do everything right, even if you save diligently and keep it somewhere safe and never touch it for years, there's no guarantee 6 months will be enough. The next recession could be worse. Your industry could implode. The medical emergency could be catastrophic. The fund is a cushion, not a cure, but it's still the difference between falling onto concrete and falling onto foam. Most people won't build it. They'll have reasons, good reasons. Life is expensive and the future is abstract and nothing bad has happened yet. They'll keep meaning to start next month. And then one day, 93 days after the layoff, they'll wish they had. Because the emergency fund isn't about optimism or pessimism. It's about buying yourself options when the world stops giving them to you for free. The question isn't if you'll need it. The question is whether it'll be there when you do.